Today, we are honored to meet Mr. Stjuart Gilman, recognized international anti-corruption expert who has worked for many decades with many governments and international bodies in the world on subjects of corruption and organized crime. Mr. Gilman, welcome to Macedonia.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the interview, and it's a pleasure having the invitation to come and be with you all this week.
In the past few days, you have met with representatives from Macedonian state institutions such as the Audit Office, the Revenue Office, and the Anti-Corruption Commission. Can you tell us what are your first impressions? For example, can you tell that Macedonia is so idyllic as Denmark, for example, or as such corruptive country as Somalia?
Well, I don't think it's as corrupt as Somalia, and I don't think it's as good as Denmark. I think that Macedonians themselves expect a great deal from their government. I think that there were issues that were raised that concerned me. I think there's a lot of being done. I was very impressed today in going to Veles and their commitment to a very significant anti-corruption program and with really evidentiary material. My meetings were interesting, and I know that people are beginning to work on these kinds of issues, but as in all cases, there's much to be done. And as much as I'd like to say that people are half finished, we're probably, if I were to evaluate, and please, I've been here for a very short number of days, probably 20% is now in place, but there's a great deal of work to be done from here.
Do you think that Macedonia is on the right way fighting corruption?
Well, again, it's very difficult in a short time to make that assessment, but what I think is impressionistically what bothered me the most. I have worked for many years, both in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. And initially, in the early 1990s, there was a great deal of fear among people in discussing problems. I saw that disappear over certainly the last 10 years. I found it a bit distressing. The feeling, and not only feeling, but statements that people were a bit afraid to complain. They were a bit afraid that if they complained, something would happen to them. They would lose a contract. One of their cousins would lose their job. I was given some specific examples of that, which seems really unfortunate. Because as much as I love my country, for example, I feel that love of my country obligates me to criticize the government. It's part of a democratic society and a democratic regime. There was much to be positive about, but I think if you ask me what disturbed me most and the impression that I'm going to leave with, I thought even in meetings where people were silent, I felt some of the silence was really for fear that if they spoke up, something negative would happen. And I don't find that, for example. That's something that concerned me.
Macedonia, as you know, is advertising with the world-famous media as an attractive destination for investments, promoting itself as a country with low taxes and one-stop shops for licenses. Is this the picture you've got from your meetings you had with businessmen in the country in the past few days?
I heard of a different note. First of all, this is a beautiful country, and I hope you appreciate that. I was stunned by the mountains and the beauty of the country and the kindness of the people, and I've been shown incredible kindness. But what I worry about, because I've had to do due diligence for corporations, is some of the feedback one gets. Because on the surface, everything looks fine. The one-stop shops look fine. But then you hear that even there, I heard this from business people, their expectations, never of bribes, but of course of gifts or hiring people or whatever. And I think that Macedonia is an ideal place to do business if they can get their act better together. I think there has to be a more active role in preventing corruption. And dealing with these sorts of issues. And I think there's concern. There is concern about Macedonia. That doesn't mean the potential isn't there. That doesn't mean that it couldn't turn around very quickly. But I think it really takes political will from the top to get independent agencies, people not tied specifically or closely to the government, people who can't be removed because the government decides they don't like their decisions, in the anti-corruption agency, in the Auditor General's office, in the Revenue Office. In some cases that already exists. But I think it's really an important statement for the government to say, we trust what we're doing to the point that we will allow independent people to evaluate how well we're doing it.
How this advertising of Macedonia affects American investors, knowing the actual political situation in Macedonia that you're aware of as well?
Well, American investors, European investors, really don't know Macedonia. I don't mean to be unkind. So what they rely on are people who are business people who can come in and evaluate, look at the statistics. But of course, statistics, like anything else, they want to do is look under the statistics to see what happens. If a company is going to build a building here, what are the expectations, both of government in terms of reasonable regulation and taxation, but what is the economic rent? Economic rent is the wonderful economist term that sounds so neutral, but it describes things like corruption. How much additionally is that going to cost us? And even more importantly, from the U.S. point of view and a number of European countries, more and more those companies are responsible for their supply chain. That is, those people who are doing work for that company. So if a company in Macedonia pays a bribe, I know this is going to sound crazy to your viewers, a CEO of that company in the United States can go to jail and has gone to jail. This isn't simply, the law's on the books. People are going to jail. Companies are facing $10, $20 million fines for bribing officials in other countries through the supply chain. And although it sounds very sophisticated, supply chain are the people who supply the computers, people who provide paper, people who do a variety of other things, help in sales for their company. And so I think that when people are evaluating building facilities and creating economic development, really in Macedonia, they're trying to take all of this into their calculus. And I think the more the government does to convince people that it's more than statistics, that there's a reality here, and that they're serious about taking advantage of the opportunities here and doing something about corruption, I think the more open, the more inviting the environment will be. Advertising only goes so far, and so it's important not only to attract people to come, but when they come, make them understand and see the reality of the country that you're portraying.
The recent report of the NGO Macedonian Center for International Cooperation has shown that Macedonia has got most of the money from EU for fighting corruption, but it is least efficient in it. Did you have such a feeling after you have been familiar that out of 200 cases a year, as the Anti-Corruption Commission reveals, procedures are open only for 9 cases and none is being proceeded?
Well, I think as importantly, in a meeting with a number of state representatives from the various state agencies, what was surprising to me, and again, it's very difficult to evaluate the numbers because you have to realize what is in that, but it seems very, very low for any country. For example, I worked in the Inspector General office, and usually just for one department, our Treasury Department, and getting up to 1,000 complaints a year was fairly common. That resulted in maybe 100 cases and maybe 50 convictions. But again, we're talking about a bureaucracy that's significantly smaller than the bureaucracy here. And so in thinking about Macedonia, what I would worry about, does this make sense? And if you have no prosecutions or one prosecution, why are we expending all the money for the anti-corruption agency? Now, having said that, what was stunning in this meeting is one other person came up and said, well, our agency and department get 1,000 complaints a year. And evidently in the discussion, no one in the anti-corruption agency had any information about those. So again, in some cases, it could be simply the cases are not accumulated in any one place to really look at them and deal with them. So again, I don't want to get into pointing fingers, people aren't doing this, that, or the other, but oftentimes when anti-corruption agencies are created, there's not a sense of how cases are handed off, how information is developed, what active role they have to play. I would hope they would be independent and active, but that's very easy for an outsider to say. I think that kind of evaluation is something for the Macedonian citizenry to basically say, is this enough? Do we expect more?
Does this mean that corruption doesn't exist in this country? Looking at the numbers?
How can I say this any other way? First of all, you will never get rid of corruption, ever. All countries have it. The question is, how quickly can you catch it? And how quickly can you punish it? And at the end of the day, what you want to do is control corruption so it has the least impact on the economy, the safety, and the security of the average citizen on the street of Macedonia. I think the question the government should be asking is the citizen there. Do they feel free from bribery? Do they feel threatened? Do they feel like they are going to be confronted in one shape, form, or another with some form of corruption? And that's what I would urge people to really think about. It seems to me that if you really love your country, you'll do everything possible to make it as safe and secure from this kind of corruption as you possibly can. Because all governments, I would hope, want to serve their citizens. And what better way to do it than take away that level of insecurity, that level of fear perhaps, that might come with corruption, where you feel you lack the control over your own life.
Mm-hmm. Because you mentioned, you reminded me, you mentioned earlier that because you're expert for the Balkans as well, can you compare the quantity of fear with the citizens in Macedonia, let's say in Serbia, in other countries, and the amount of fear that is present now?
I want to be very careful. I've been here less than a week. I've had multiple meetings and it's been great. I mean, the Macedonian citizens have been very welcoming, very enjoyed this, but I've got a very limited information. But it was surprising, without coaxing or without asking questions, how many individuals said they were fearful about complaining. Not fearful for their life, but basically fearful about complaining. They felt that punishments would be meted out. Look, sometimes this can be in the imagination and the cultural mind, but it seems to me the government would do well to try and put people at ease. That criticizing the government is not only their right, it's their obligation in living in a society that calls itself democratic. That's a healthy thing. That's not a bad thing. Because how do you change unless you know where the problems are? And it seems to me citizens are the best litmus test for where problems are. I did talk to the business community. I talked to the NGO community. I talked to large multinational representatives, I talked to government officials. I've talked to the media. I've now talked to a small community. And again, one of the senses was, not for all, but for too many, the sense that if I say something, something bad's going to happen, even if it's a minor complaint. And so that's something that I think is never healthy. And again, without overgeneralizing, I think it's at least worthwhile examining, both from the media point of view, but also the government. I would think would take it seriously, because if that's what you're setting in people's mind without your intention, then you're creating an environment where, in effect, no change can occur.
Mr. Gilman, Macedonia has signed the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. What does this document obligate Macedonia for?
Well, it obligates Macedonia to do a number of things. And the UN Convention, just by way of explanation, under the Macedonian Constitution, the UN Convention has become part of your organic law. In other words, it is legally binding. And if you look at the provisions for an independent anti-corruption agency, for whistleblower hotlines, for an effective asset declaration system, for governing very specific activities of corporations in terms of their accounting and their books, of the limitations of hiring former government officials into those situations, and looking at the expectation around the judiciary for the judiciary basically governing itself to make sure that it's maintaining integrity. The avenues open that are required to be open to the public and to the media in terms of information, avenue to the anti-corruption agency, not only to see their reports, but to regularly meet with the anti-corruption agency in terms of having it open and active in terms of dealing with the media and citizens. There are a whole host of other things within there, and I don't want to limit it because there's criminal law, there's international relations, there's asset recovery provisions, there's aid provisions, there are a whole variety of other things there. But the point basically is it would be good for not only the government, but for the average Macedonian citizen to take a look at this. It's available online in English and in Russian, if either of those languages are comfortable. And I hope that it's actually translated into Macedonian and Albanian, because I think it's very helpful to understand not only what the government obligations are, but what citizen rights are in the convention. I think it's very important, and it's part of your law.
You have been working on issues of corruption with countries such as Serbia, Egypt, Morocco, and South Africa, Philippines. When it comes to corruption, are there common issues about all these countries?
I think there are, because they're all in all of these countries, and in fairness, even in the United States historically, even in Canada, even in places like New Zealand, everyone has roots of corruption. But the dilemma oftentimes, because they're new governments, and they've been in authoritarian regimes, there are old habits, and they're bad habits. They're old habits in the sense that, well, we have to allow corruption because we can't pay public officials enough. Or as a government official, I have a right to demand of people to show up in my office, and I would love to have a new church built on the corner. My priest has come to me and said, we need this, and we would like you as good corporate citizens to pay for the new church. Well, you know, someone asked of that. I have no idea the specifics. This happened in the Philippines. What choice do you have? If you're running a company and the finance minister invites you in this kind of meeting, how can you say no? What's going to happen to your business? What will happen? Are you going to suddenly get an audit from the tax authority because you didn't contribute to his church? The point basically is government officials need to understand that they have to be held to higher standards than the rest of citizens. They should be above suspicion. You know, the term in English is purer than Caesar's wife. You want no question asked about your integrity, to the point that, you know, some government officials actually will go overboard to avoid even the impression that somehow or another they're doing inappropriate actions. And in saying that, that's not a bad thing, because in a democracy, government officials work for the people. They don't really work for themselves. That's not their money. Their salary is not their money. Their salary is a reward for the work they're doing on behalf of Macedonians. And I think in some governments, and it's really unfortunate, in the transition to democratic institutions, that voice in the back of their head gets lost. And it's a good reminder to have perhaps an angel on their shoulder to remind them every now and then, you work for the people. What are you doing for the people? Not for the party, not for the government, not for myself, not for my wife or my uncle or my cousin. What am I doing for the people of Macedonia that's going to benefit them, that's going to benefit our children's children? How am I creating the future for our country?
Mr. Gilman, thank you for your interview you have given for Inbox 7.
It's been my great pleasure. It's been a joy not only speaking with you, but actually getting to know many of my Macedonian, I consider them friends and colleagues now. So thank you very much, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you. This was Mr. Stjuart Gilman, the international anti-corruption expert who has shared experiences with Inbox 7 from his visit to Macedonia these days.